Good afternoon, good evening, depending on which part of the world you are joining us. Thank you so much for logging in, and for those that have joined us physically, thank you so much for being there. We welcome you to this space that we are hosting at the Springs meetings of the IMF and World Bank within the Civil Society Policy Forum. I am Lumonia Faith, and I'll be your moderator for today. I am the Economic Justice and Climate Action Lead at Akina Mama Africa, and Akina Mama Africa is a Pan-African feminist leadership development organization that was founded in 1985 by a group of African women who are living in the diaspora, who remain keenly aware of their African roots and the need to organize autonomously. We were named Akina Mama, which means solidarity among African women, and we are mainly known for our boldness in addressing systems and structures of oppression. We are unapologetic about challenging patriarchy, sexism, homophobia, colonialism, neocolonialism, imperialism, and neoliberalism, and all those other isms that continuously subjugate women. We center the lived experiences and realities of African women in all their diversities. And through our flagship program, the African Women Leadership Institute, we contribute towards building feminist leadership and collective power to deconstruct intersectional systems of oppression as we advance gender and social justice. Today, in today's discussion, we'll focus on the topic of financing a just transition, Global South feminist perspectives on the different innovative climate finance instruments that are being advanced, particularly in countries facing multiple crises. This session is hosted by Akina Mama together with the Institute for Economic Justice, the African Women's Development and Communication Network, Feminist, the Southern and Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiations Institute, SEATINI in Uganda, Christian Aid, HIVOS, South North, Economic Justice for Women Project in Zimbabwe, and the Voices for Just Climate Action Alliance. So, World Bank has been at the front line in advancing different climate finance instruments and approaches in order to maximize the impact of climate action. And this has been through mobilizing and deploying concessional funding. However, the nature of some of these instruments presents challenges for countries, particularly for countries with limited fiscal space, coupled with climate vulnerabilities, poverty, and gender inequality. So this session will attempt to present evidence on the need to rethink many of these new and so-called innovative climate finance instruments to ensure that climate finance is contextual and is applicable to countries, particularly countries in the Global South that are facing multiple crises, and to ensure that climate finance structures and mode of delivery are inclusive, that they are just, and that they are sustainable. It will also discuss what the World Bank can do to bring its climate finance plans and the broader global financial architecture in line with gender justice, economic justice, and climate justice. So I have with me a stellar panel that will lead us through this discussion. And this particular panel includes Mariana Paoli, who is the Global Policy and Advocacy Lead at Christian Aid, and is also part of CAN International, and she's physically present in Washington in the room. Jen Nalunga, who is the Executive Director of the Southern and Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiations Institute, who is also in Washington. And then we'll have Collins Otieno, who is the Global Climate Finance and Innovation Lead at HIVOS East Africa, who will be joining us virtually like myself. And we will also have Anne Kuriakose, who is the Senior Social Development Specialist and Gender and Climate Lead at the World Bank's Global Gender Group. and she'll definitely be joining us physically. So we will have a plenary session, but before the plenary session, we'll have Fatma Ahmed from Sudan and Gertrude Tala from Kenya, who will share with us empirical evidence from their experiences working on climate finance at the community level. So without wasting any more time, I would like to invite Mariana Paoli. And I would like you, Mariana, to kick us off with a reflection on on your broad analysis and perspectives on what the global the global climate finance architecture looks like. So over to you, Marianne.
Hello, thank you so much, Faith, and good morning to all of you, and hello to all of you online as well. Indeed, Faith, I just wanted to kick us off with the question you raised. How would a global architecture reform should look like to align with the gender justice, climate justice, and economic justice perspectives? And that question is really important because we're looking at an architecture that is really outdated, especially as we know today's financial systems are failing the people and the planet. We're facing that climate crisis, growing poverty and inequality, and we just know that business as usual approaches are just not working. As Faith mentioned, the Global South is faced enormous fiscal constraints and unaffordable finance. The debt crisis, the higher cost of capital and tax dodging, alongside with the global private financial systems, are unfairly distorted against the poor. We also see, in terms of climate finance, a growing growing spending needs. We know that today the gap is unmet and growing. The last Finance Committee figures show that 5.8 or 5.9 trillions are needed by 2030 for the NDCs in the Global South. Now, we know that money is there. When you compare, for example, the military spending of NATO countries, it's always 2.64% of GDP, and when you in military spending, when you compare, for example, with the ODA by OECD countries, it's on average 0.33%, so much lower. And we think that to meet all the needs when we're thinking about the finance needed, it's really important to replace and reclaim the centrality of public finance to deliver climate and development action. This is absolutely central. It's a cross-political issue, and we know when you look at the climate negotiations, for example, how much the lack of finance is stopping action in all fronts. We know how much this public finance is new, additional grant space is really central for loss and damage, for adaptation, for just transition and NDCs. Now, to what extent the private finance can be used for the climate action? We know that it neglects adaptation, is completely inadequate for loss and damage, and even when you look about a transition and a just transition, there's only so much profits that can be found. So, and I think this is perhaps one of the central points of our discussion today. Scaling up public finance has to be based on CBDR, the common but differential responsibilities and capabilities. It has to be based on equity and reparations to the Global South. The Global North must deliver its fair share of climate finance. Now, it's very common that we hear that, but there's not enough public finance. It's limited. Those figures are astronomical, right? However, we know there's a combination of both political will, but also there are different means. If we address some of the main gaps on why public finance is limited, let's look at the debt issue and how much developing countries are paying, servicing the debt. Let's look at tax dodging, tax evasion, tax avoidance that countries are going through at the moment. And we know that also, when you look about tax, it's not just closing the loopholes, but we're also looking at innovative sources of finance that could be used. Wealth taxation, progressive taxes, making polluters pay. There's a number of instruments that can really hamper replace the money for public money for both climate and development action. Now, we're also watching as part of the package, not just perhaps inappropriate use of the role of the private sector as the silver bullet when it's not, but also other false finance solutions. For example, carbon offsets which are essentially permits to continue business as usual, or debt swaps who are very limited and can able to legitimize a debt that is illegitimate. Insurance, and the list continues. What we see in the realm of the negotiations is not only of the climate negotiations, that not only northern countries haven't fulfilled their fair shares and the commitment with the Paris Agreement, not delivering the 100 billion, but actually want to even reopen what is called the contributors base. And that brings me the question about access and what it has to do with our discussions here. Well, how climate finance should be channeled. And then the question we're all here discussing is, what is the role of the World Bank and other MDBs in delivering climate finance? We know that business as usual are not delivering. We know that, well, the World Bank is a bank and preferring to disperse the finance through loans. And there is a risk of those loans worsening the debt crisis at the moment. And especially when we're looking at if these loans on the top could come with potentially conditionalities and other things, or as you see, for example, in terms of other mechanisms used for the IMF, like the RST coming with green conditionalities as well. We cannot have a bigger bank without looking at issues of transparency, how the climate finance is used, and to what extent there is inclusion in this process. And first and foremost, the governance of IFIs is really important for us to look at, because we know that the Global South have very limited voice and participation in IFIs. We know that more democratic institutions like the UN, and you have other funds like the Green Climate Fund, where you have equal representation, could be more adequate avenues to deliver that climate finance. And we also know that since the Paris Agreement was signed, the World Bank has funded more than 15 billion in fossil fuels. So we cannot have an institution wanting to play a major championing role in delivering the climate finance before a radical change on what that better approach should look like, without stopping all of this. So I guess what we are bringing here is that let's stop, let's reframe, and rethink what better should really look like. So in the context of gender justice, tax justice, climate justice, that discussion is key, and I'm looking forward to engage further and hear from other speakers on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mariana, for that very elaborate initial sharing of what the the global climate finance architecture looks like. And I think for me, one of the things that stands out, and which is something that we need to deeply discuss, is the issue of expanding the contributors base. And I think it's important for us to deeply reflect on that, because it's also part of something that the World Bank has also in a way contributed to. So thank you so much. So building on from some of the issues that Mariana has highlighted, and I would like to invite you, Jen, to share with us your reflections, and more specifically from the perspective of the privatization and the whole push around leveraging private sector financing. So over to you, Jen. Thank you for joining.
Thank you so much, Faith, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for being here for this conversation, and thanks, Faith, and also Mariana, for organizing this session. I will start with looking at what is a just transition. Faith has talked about a just, inclusive, sustainable transition. So what's the transition? And we all know that we are transitioning from a fuel, fossil fuel, to a low carbon economy, using climate-friendly energy, clean energy like solar, wind, and all that. But I think a transition to be just and fair, it has to be also context-based. A transition for the US is not the same as a transition of Uganda, or a transition for a woman in rural Uganda. So it has to be really, really context-based and should look at the reality. For example, women in Africa, the transition could start from having clean energy for cooking clean energy, clean lighting. Some of you who are from Africa know how women struggle, to light, to cook, So maybe when we are looking at a feminist lenses of the transition, we need to be a bit specific, because sometimes we look at it so broadly: hydrogen, the EVs, those electric vehicles. But for a woman in the village, I don't think that makes sense. So if we are looking at a just transition, it has to take into account the reality of the different communities. And today we are talking about innovative financing, because the actual mainstream financing is not there. The broken promises. As you remember, in 2017, there was a promise by developed countries to provide $100 billion, is it per year? That money is not there. So today, that's why we are discussing the whole issue of innovative financing. It's because that money is not coming. We hope, but in the meantime, we are looking at the innovative financing. And when we talk about innovative financing, climate financing, we are talking about the green bonds. In fact, that whole range of the rainbow bonds, the green bonds, the blue bonds, the orange bonds, all of those are part of that innovative financing. Then we talk about the carbon credits, the debt nature swaps, the blended financing. All these are the innovative climate financing which have been put on table, and many more are coming up. the innovative financing, they have their own advantages because they are helping us to invest in climate adaptation. They provide the resources. But I think we need to dig deeper, and I agree with Mariana, on the issue of indebtedness, because these are private sector based innovative financing, and they are looking for profits. The bonds are loans. We already indebted, but we are encouraged to get more and more resources, more and more loans to address issues of climate adaptation, climate mitigation, and also the whole issue around energy transition. So we are looking at deeper indebtedness. Yet, we have already discussed the issue of polluters should be the ones paying, and the whole issue around ecological debt. But we are seeing a challenge with this innovative climate financing, pushing poor countries deeper and deeper into debt. For example, you look at the issue of the carbon credits. Carbon credits is also about turning the forests and nature into investable assets. And what happens to the people who are the communities? And we are seeing a lot of displacements in Africa because of these carbon credits and the forests, and the entire this innovation around carbon credits is also affecting the communities. So we need to look deeper into these innovative climate financing instruments. But what's important really is the fact that we can't address climate challenges really based entirely on private money, because private money is about making profits. And if there are people who are benefiting, the women and the poor, it's by accident, because the major objective of private financing is making profits. So we are turning climate again into an investable venture, people to make money. And we have seen this not just also in climate, but in other sectors, in land, in agriculture, So there is a lot of financialization where global capital is out looking for resources. So for me, I think it's important. Later on, I will talk about the recommendations. But I think for now, we need for each innovative climate financing, let us analyze it, look at it deeper, and be able to ascertain whether that's the right financing instruments to help us have an inclusive, fair, and just transition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jen, for unpacking that. And I think for me, the thing that stands out for me from what you just shared with us is the issue of the privatization. And we've seen how, for example, public-private partnerships and blended finance have not delivered in the sectors like healthcare, in sectors like education. In Uganda, since 2019, we've been under promise to get an international hospital, and this was following promissory notes that were given to a private investor to establish a hospital in Kampala, but it has never really happened. And so I think it's important for us to really reflect and rethink the ways in which private sector is being relied on when it comes to particularly delivering on social issues. And we know that the climate crisis is a societal issue, and we can't assume that financing that is aimed at maximizing profits will be able to deliver justice. Yeah, so thank you very much for Jen for those very insightful reflections. So I will now come online to Collins. And Collins, we know that there are a number of nature-based solutions that the World Bank has been promoting for a long time, and many activists have had concerns around the extent to which these solutions are locally led and whether or not they will they are transformative practices. Within the context of climate finance, we are also seeing that increasingly nature-based solutions are being applied. Could you help us unpack this?
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Faith. Let me know that I can be heard. And indeed, quite a number of nature-based solutions have been used and applied by the World Bank or other financial institutions to be able to promote mobilization of climate finance. But I had a teacher before who mentioned to me that lessons are very bad students because they arrive late in class, but equally very good students because at the end of the day, they help you chart way forward. And having worked with communities for over some few years now, we have a few lessons that we can be able to authoritatively talk about, that we can be able to reflect on to be able to help us, especially in shaping mobilization of climate finance to support local climate solutions. First of such, I would want to probably... Faith?
We can hear you.
Okay. Sorry, I thought you're not hearing me for some minutes. So yeah, first of such that I would want to talk about, and I think I will also try comment about in the later stages of my conversation today. I think I'll try to reflect about carbon market. But as I start now, I think I would want to start from the point of debt nature swaps. One of the not so nature-based solutions, but partially nature-based solutions that have been promoted, especially in the rise towards the Africa Climate Summit, was debt for nature swap. Well, I know probably most of us in the room understand and know what debt for nature swaps are. Probably we can just take a few minutes to explain a bit what debt for nature swaps are, so that at least together with the rest of the participants, we are together and moving in tandem. Debt for nature swap, at their best understanding, is quote unquote innovative climate finance, in which portion of developing nations' foreign debt is forgiven in exchange of local investment in environmental conservation measures. At their establishment, that is what debt for nature swaps were to do. To date, we have seen countries including Gambia or Gabon, together with Kenya, especially through the support of TNC, ratifying and signing of quite a number of debt for nature swap. The last one, especially signed towards the beginning of the Africa Climate Summit, was almost a 60 billion debt for nature swap. One of the things that probably we need to understand is that while the promoters of debt for nature swaps do promote this in the sense of debt relief, in the sense of profit, in the sense of funding conservation, there are several ways and there are several reasons as to why communities are opposed to debt for nature swaps. First, it is essential to note that debt for nature swaps produce only minor debt reductions. And I would want us to look at data. They generate less funding than the face value of debt purchased in the secondary market. Look at any debt for nature swap, and for sure, you will realize that they generate less funding than the actual value purchased in the secondary market. The amount of debt relieved by these swaps, even in participating countries, accounts for less than 1% of the total external debt. So if you debt for nature swap and weighed it in this particular scale, you'll realize that most of these negotiated debt for nature swaps account for less than 1% of the total external debt of such particular countries. Besides that, I think some of the issues, and I'm going to give us 5 issues why debt for nature swaps probably are not working, include the impact on effectiveness and within communities. So if you look at debt for nature swaps, they are always not leading to any significant positive environmental outcomes. While intention to promote conservation efforts are pursued with this particular debt for nature swaps, the actual impact on biodiversity and ecosystems vary quite a bit with the intended purpose of these particular instruments. The other thing is, we all know that debt for nature swaps, and if you look at communities that have already negotiated debt for nature swaps, especially in Kenya, in Gabon, you realize that debt for nature swaps fall short of the principles of equity and social justice. And I'm going to explain to us that adaptation is one of our fundamental concerns in Africa. Unfortunately, debt for nature swaps can inadvertently exacerbate social inequalities. For instance, the benefits of conservation efforts may not always reach local communities directly. What happens when communities negotiate debt for nature swaps and their lands are taken is that their vulnerability, their susceptibility to the impacts of climate change is largely aggravated. The decision-making processes often involve external actors such as NGOs, which ideally do not attribute or contribute, have any contribution from the community voices while negotiating these particular deals. There's a bit of lack, quite a bit of lack of transparency, especially in the negotiation of debt for nature swaps. And that brings me to my third point on transparency. The negotiation and the execution of debt for nature swaps lack transparency. Details about the terms and conditions are never put out there. And that is not quite apart from carbon markets, which already have been talked about, but I think I'll also talk about that. There's the complexity and the complexity of the implementation of this particular debt for nature swaps, which is the fundamental point when dealing with debt for nature swaps. So debt for nature swaps in nature have very intricate negotiations among multiple stakeholders, and you and I can already guess who is always left out in this particular negotiations. So ensuring effective implementation and monitoring of conservation projects require a robust capacity in communities, something that is never done before any negotiation for any debt for nature swap project. So unfortunately, this brings about a lot of complexity that communities can never be involved in monitoring, in verification, in reporting. So it's for the big boys to handle, and the communities are left somewhere outside to be able to just look and suffer the consequences of such negotiations. The last but not least point within the challenges that deal or come with is the fact that it's a market-based approach. And I think when Faith was laying some fundamentals in the beginning, one of the things she mentioned that we are very bold in countering the other themes that come with the neo-colonialism and the like. So debt for nature swaps, being market-based element, brings about a bit of confusion and in a way that it goes at what we started with when laying the foundation, that we are based on the principles of CBDR. So the moment that we start protecting the environment on contingent debt relief, then we are already outside the principle of CBDR. So the focus on financial transactions always overshadow broader systemic changes needed for sustainable development, which comes attached to conservation of environment and protection of other fauna and flora. And these are 5 key fundamental facts why debt for nature swaps are never working. I think another thing that and I said I would probably talk about this is the issue of carbon markets, structured in such a way that brings out what we call innovative solution or ways to mobilizing private finance and mobilizing finance for climate action in Africa. Carbon markets, as mentioned before, is basically a point of pollution, to say the least. It's permission to pollute. And I would want to probably draw us to the RED Plus project of the World Bank. One of the things that we really need to, and I'm going to give this particular presentation based on the World Bank RED Plus project. World Bank providing a platform where countries can be able to invest in carbon markets only deprives of public climate finance flows. And this is one thing that carbon markets has done to public climate finance flows. So attracting investment from other countries to RED Plus to engage in carbon markets projects is only a hindrance to what we started with by laying a foundation that we would appreciate and guide the institution, the bank, to be able to invest in public climate finance flows. So while this still continue, we have a study that already has some bit of findings that such investment in carbon markets especially has a lot of implication of public climate finance flows, because most of the countries, especially in the developed countries, have decided to channel their finances through carbon markets and leave out what they are occasionally aligned to, which was public climate finance flows. So these are some of the fundamental issues that are very intricate that we as civil society organizations, especially within the Global South, are keen to ensure that the World Bank gets right, especially in providing climate finance for local climate actions. So I think I'll stop at that and give it back to Faith.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Colin, for unpacking that. I think that each one of us has a deeper understanding of some of the damages that mechanisms and solutions like debt for nature swaps, carbon credits that Jen had also already spoken about could have to communities and the different societies that some of us work with. And so it's important that we are rethinking and reimagining some of these different approaches and really centering the experiences and lived realities of these different individuals who rarely get the opportunity to amplify their voices. So I will now invite, finally, on the panel, I'll invite Anne from the World Bank, and specifically the Gender Department, to share with us. We know that the World Bank has been developing a new World Bank gender strategy, and we all here are curious to hear and to learn from you about how the Gender Department envisions that this particular strategy will be able to guide and ensure that gender and not just the usual gender mainstreaming approaches, that gender transformative approaches are integrated with throughout the bank's climate finance instruments, mechanisms, and strategies to ensure that the rights of women, the rights of youth, of indigenous communities, and other structurally excluded people are centered, and that these different approaches do not roll back the little progress that has already been made when it comes to gender equality. So over to you, Anne, and Anne is in Washington and physically present within the state. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Faith. It's a real pleasure to be here today and have the chance to engage with all of you on these really important topics. As you know, the World Bank has put climate and poverty and gender right at the top of its agenda. The new mission focuses on eradication of poverty on a livable planet. And I've been working at the bank since 2005 and in climate since 2008. And I can really testify to the evolution of our approach and how far it's kind of now mainstreamed in a kind of whole of bank effort. And this is both in response to what we've seen as needs, but also the real demands coming from our client countries who have pushed us to really be able to support them in terms of technical assistance and thinking in terms of fiscal space, what this looks like for support across a range of sectors, and what it means for fundamental kind of foundational investments in populations. So when we think about adaptive capacity, for example, in the context of countries, it's not just the hard infrastructure investments in roads and transport and energy, renewable energy, as we talk about the shift, but also those sorts of human capital investments in health, education, gender equality, and the process-oriented things around governance and transparency that all our speakers today have so rightly brought to the fore. So I'd like to just give you a little bit of background as to some of the pieces we've been looking at from the gender group, and how these link back to the broader efforts of the bank overall in terms of sector investments and support to countries in planning for capacity development across a range of departments. As was mentioned, I'm serving as a gender and climate lead for the bank, and I also draw a bit on my experience leading the Climate Investment Fund's gender program for 7 years, which was kind of $12 billion set of funds working across 72 countries in forests and energy and climate resilience and a whole range of areas that I think fundamentally were about supporting kind of capacity building, decision making at different levels, so working with national sectoral ministries, but also all the way down across scales down to the local level, particularly around our dedicated grant mechanism, which we've been talking about. Forest investments was a fund set up specifically, and we had to reform World Bank policies to be able to do this, where funds were going directly to CSOs of community organizations, indigenous peoples groups, with a real focus as well on women's leadership and investments that were both kind of working across scales in terms of reform in forest policy, but also very much about economic empowerment for local communities and thinking about those sorts of investments in non-timber forest product value chains and these sorts of things where women in particular have both an economic interest but also sometimes cultural or non-monetary sort of food security kind of concerns around these different areas. And so this issue was brought up earlier as well around what does this look like in terms of the debt for nature swaps, et cetera. And the programs that come to mind are more around the payment for environmental services sorts of projects in the RED Plus context. And there, it's absolutely about kind of assigning rights to communities and making sure within communities that women, for example, have rights to those flows of funds so that you're combating kind of inequality at multiple levels, right? And so when we've seen what this looks like in the context of larger bank programs, it's working both on the nitty-gritty of some of those forest-linked transfers and payments for the work that indigenous communities often are doing, but also working with national parties around making sure that legislation that's on the books is more fair and inclusive in terms of tenure security and these sorts of things that make a real difference to economic security for women and men. So coming to our new gender group strategy, which is kind of going to our board this year in the spring before June, to really be shifting towards a gender transformative approach and working on areas of economic empowerment, human capital, real push on gender-based violence, and also women's leadership. And we're not thinking of this only in terms of individual women in different positions, but also thinking much more systemically about these governance questions of how are women included at multiple scales, from local to subnational, regional, and up to national level across countries. Because this is, as we've talked about lessons, I liked Colin's admonition that we, learn from the lessons and also put them in their correct place. And it's been really a hard-won battle over time to make sure that those processes are in place to secure social and economic rights and security for vulnerable populations across a range of investments. And so for the gender and climate program that's coming out of this, we're really looking at 4 main areas. And this is kind of encompassing the whole of the World Bank group, World Bank, but also IFC, so private sector questions have been raised. And across these areas, we're always looking for distributional outcomes. So, for example, in the just transition, when we're thinking about green jobs and skill investment, it's not just that we want to see, we want job quality and kind of high-value jobs, but we also want to make sure that we're not just focusing on the highest skilled, the women engineers, et cetera, although we are also pushing that in specific programs, but we're looking for inclusive opportunities for women at a range of scales. And we know that women are particularly vulnerable in terms of occupational sex segregation, very much in primary sectors, in agriculture, livestock, forestry, et cetera. And we're looking for those off-farm opportunities and the sorts of complementary investments that can come together and really make a difference. So in renewable energy, we're not just looking at large-scale power generation, but also thinking about energy efficiency and energy access. And for Africa, we've got targets now for 2030 of an additional 250 million people being covered by improved energy services. And that's both the distribution, but also the quality of those in terms of reliability. And that has a huge impact on women's security in terms of, lighting as it's used, and a whole range of economic opportunities. We've seen, again, taking lessons from very good CSO models, enterprise development opportunities for women in kind of solar light enterprises, either as kind of sale and marketing people, but also as solar technicians, selling skills in rooftop solar and off-grid kind of mini-grid investments, which is really a step change in terms of livelihood opportunities compared to kind of agricultural labor and these much more precarious sorts of employment that majority of women around the world are involved in. And so our program is broadly divided into 4 areas around climate finance and making sure, as many have said today, that those processes are transparent and inclusive. In the climate investment funds, we had 50-50 kind of representation on our board of developed and developing countries, and also a formal role for CSO observers from the non-governmental organizations, as well as from private sector and indigenous peoples organizations. And they worked as a kind of watchdog, sitting with our board on reporting what was happening in country on each project as it came for discussion and the overall investment plan for the countries. So we absolutely value that important role of bringing together a range of actors with very kind of legitimate and formal roles. So it's not just a kind of comment, but it actually needs to be taken on board, and MDBs were required to respond to those issues that were raised in front of the entire board of developed and developing countries. And those sorts of investments and partnerships over time, I think, really bore fruit. The second area is around climate governance, and here a lot of the push is really on systemic processes and thinking, for example, around gender and climate budgeting. What does that look like at the macro level when we're looking at allocation across sectors, but what does it look like in terms of the flow of funds down through different governance levels? So I think we're hearing about the Kenya FLOCA project later from another panelist today. And that's an example where we're trying simultaneously to make sure that changes are happening at the local level, but that the fiscal and governance processes are being strengthened across scales within the country. And that's ultimately a more sustainable effort, we think. Our third area is around assets for resilience. And here, Again, not just thinking in terms of, the kind of protective elements or cash transfers, this sort of thing, but thinking in terms of real security, in terms of land title for women, increased human capital investments, or also very much making that linkage between the investments that are happening at an individual kind of household level as well as the area level. So in the context of adaptive social protection, for example, we're not seeing it as just trying to buffer households from income shocks, from extreme events, from weather, for example, but also absolutely thinking about productive safety nets that are kind of transforming skills and leading to more remunerative paths over time. And those sorts of small-scale infrastructure investments that can help improve resilience of areas. So investments in soil and water infrastructure and those small pieces attached to public works that make a difference in the medium term for communities. And then the final area is around just transition and inclusive decarbonization, which is quite a big chunky area. Because on the decarbonization side, you're thinking very much in terms of medium-term investments in what it means to transform economies and societies in this context. So the investments in transport and energy and water, all of these big pieces, but also what that means in terms of whether you consider some of these investments, progressive or regressive. What are the distributional impacts? We do subsidy analyses around reforms and these sorts of things. And on the just transition side, again, thinking across scales, we're not looking just at...
I request you to begin to
wrap up.
To begin to wind up.
Absolutely.
Yeah, to wrap up. Yeah.
Just my last point here on the just transition, that we're looking not just at workers who might be displaced, but all those indirect workers in the communities, often women who are supplying, say, coal plant workers in that context, and also what coal phase-out, for example, means for larger communities, because they're often based on one industry and very vulnerable to these economic shifts, as well as being kind of physically isolated, economically disadvantaged, and often socially excluded as well. So I will leave it there, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a flavor of the sorts of considerations that come into mind when we're looking at these national investments, and then what that means in terms of design at the local level. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Anne, for unpacking part of what the World Bank has been doing to ensure gender integration in this whole process that we are speaking about when we talk about climate finance. I think for me, one of the things that stands out from your submission, from your sharing, is the issue around what we truly mean when we talk about structural transformation, when we talk about addressing the structural issues, the systemic issues. Is it just about bringing structurally excluded persons into the room or enhancing their participation? Or is it also about deeply reflecting on how some of the policy frameworks, of the policy ideologies that we are adopting do impact the ways in which they'll benefit or not benefit from some of the interventions being put in place? And I think for me, the next set of our conversation is one that I like the most, because we are getting into, for example, Gertrude sharing with us about FLOCA that you already talked about, and we all know that FLOCA is a loan, and that when we are speaking about integrating gender and ensuring that women and other marginalized groups are centered, it's important that we are reflecting on, for instance, issues around privatization, issues around deregulation, issues around liberalization, which are really the fundamental ideologies that the bank has been front and center in promoting. So I think for me, it's for you to live with that particular reflection of how do we transform the system, not by just merely attempting to pinkwash it or greenwash it, but to actually transform the system so that those that have been marginalized for far too long can, for once, be centered. So thank you so much. I'll now invite Gertrude, and Gertrude and Fatima will basically open up the plenary conversation. So once they have shared, I will invite the audience, both online and physical, to be able to share their reflections and any questions with our panelists. Over to you, Gertrude.
Thank you so much, Faith. Good morning, everyone. Good evening for them that are in East Africa. My name is Gertrude Tala from Women's Empowerment Link. I come from a women rights, women-led organization based in Kenya. And we invest in enhancing women and girls realizing their full potential, worth, strength, both politically, socially, economically, through advocating for their rights and social justice. So today I'm here to speak about FLOCA. And I think Anne has even mentioned about it. And I'm really glad that that is something that we're speaking about today, even as we speak about the kind of climate financing that we envision, especially in the global south. And maybe for them that do not know about FLOCA, FLOCA is financing locally led climate action, and it's actually a loan to the Kenya government. And I think she had said it has been devolved because Kenya is a devolved government. So FLOCA is also devolved from the national government, where it's hosted. It's hosted by the national treasury, then to the county government, then down to the ward level, of which wards are the lowest unit of governance in Kenya. So we have 47 counties. So at the county level, 45 of those, minus 2 of them, which are cities, are beneficiaries of the FLOCA. Then those 45 counties then have devolved their financing to the ward level where it's managed, and that is managed by committees. There's a unit called Ward Climate Change Committee that consists of 9 people that then has the function of really now deciding how the kind of the project that will take place there. And I think I'd want to mention this is a quote that I have, that we cannot borrow towards climate resilience. I know we all know that we know that climate change is a crisis. It's not something that we all want to happen, but especially the most affected have found themselves in a situation. And also when it comes to financing, for example, speaking of the financing being devolved, then that means that the decisions are made up there. So even the way this facility came to exist was not in the control of the people. So they did not decide whether we will get it as a grant or we'll get it as a loan. But then it has trickled down, and when it comes to deciding, that then is done at the ward level, where now the communities are the ones participating and deciding what projects they would want. And just to go to the details, maybe there were requirements that the counties had to have before they would receive this money. This is a 5-year loan. And I have some background in credit management, and we usually say when you take a loan, it's time bound. It's time bound, every minute counts. So for over 5 years, a county receiving money, and this is a county that was expected to have a certain number of requirements, including the Climate Change Act, having the unit, having a unit more like an office with a directorate, with the executive, people who will be able to take the executive mandate, and also to have a participatory climate and risk assessment. All those were required, and all those took time. And I think for me today is just for us to look at how having a financial instrument that is a loan, what is the benefit, how our community is affected, because then that means if it's going to serve a public or rather provide public services, then that means if it's a loan, then the public are the ones who are going to facilitate it or rather pay it back. So for example, I'll give a scenario of the county where I mostly interact with the community, and those are islands. And I've been able to follow up with them. And for example, this certain ward had 11 projects. And out of those 11 projects, only 3 projects they had 11 priorities, only 3 were shortlisted based on the finances they were expecting. Again, because the amount were limited, each ward, which has up to 40,000 people, were receiving 35 USD, 35,000 USD. So you can tell that is less than I think that should be less than $1 per person. And if a project is being done that is costing 35,000 USD for 40,000 people, then that means that is a very small project that not everybody will benefit from. And if it's a loan, yet not everyone is benefiting from it. Yet when it comes to paying the loan, then that will mean that everyone, of course, the payment comes in terms of taxation, increase in taxation, and other ways. Then that means that there will be people who are affected by climate change. There was some sort of solution that was brought, or seemingly some sort of solution, but then that it was not beneficial to them, and they have to pay the loan because everyone pays the loan in one way or another. So I think for me, looking at that and having that discussion recently was quite heartbreaking, knowing that this money might not get to the people who need it the most. But also looking at it and really thinking about the 5 years and how much time was taken to develop the structures and really make these counties or wards qualify for this money. It has really taken a lot of time because of where we were as counties, as wards, as a country, really. So you need to qualify for this money, but you need to do 1, 2, 3, up to 10 things. Then that takes a lot of money, a big chunk of that money. The support for, there was a chunk of it that was meant for really coming up with this structure, and that is called the County Climate Change Institutional Support, which was 100,000 USD per year for 3 years. And all that is needed for 3 years just to set up all these structures. Then, of course, out of the 5 years, time has really lapsed by the time all these structures are made, and now projects have to begin. And I want to remind you that also this is a loan, meaning in two years' time, we should have figured out how we will get money to pay back, but also probably made some profit in a way that if there are interests, then we are able to pay back. And when I looked at the projects that wards had come up with, 2 of them, I've looked at 2 of them where I really interact with the women and the groups and the ward. And 2 of them, or rather both of the counties, are water projects. Let's look at water. Water is a very essential need. And we are taking a loan for a basic need that we are hoping to get an investment out of it. I don't know whether you can get investment out of a basic need. It's really contradicting when I look at it. Probably we're thinking of agriculture, but really within 2 years, the project is done. I think the project might be done after the 2 years. There won't be so much that has happened in terms of really making money, so that then the community is resilient enough and has money, even if there are those taxation, then they are able to really have money to pay back the loan. So I was also looking at other things, like the projects that were prioritized by the county were around water, environment, and agriculture, and that was it. Like looking at the FLOCA, it is good and that we are able to prioritize these projects, but we know that there's when it comes to climate change, it's cross-cutting, and there's so many effects that, or rather, there's the intersectionality, and we know that there's issues of violence against women that come about when there's climate crisis, there's health issues. There are very many issues that, such that if we settle for just three major issues, then that means there's so much that this financing for locally led climate action really program is not looking into, which are still major issues and things that are affecting the communities and their cross-cutting issues.
Thank you, Gertrude. Thank you, Gertrude. I'm sorry to cut you short, but I see that we are running out of time, and yet would like to hear from the audience as well, and then have some of the panelists make a response. But thank you so much for sharing that very key example, and I hope that the people from the World Bank will be able to take part of these issues that you're raising and use them as part of the process of reflecting on how to improve this particular framework, but also the government of Kenya, since it's the implementing agency. I will now invite Fatima. Fatima is going to share with us about an Africa Development Bank funded initiative. So over to you, Fatima.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Faith. Yes, my name is Fatima Ahmed. I'm representing a women organization working in all Sudan, concentrating on eastern part of Sudan. One of our main objectives is empowerment of women, especially economic empowerment. And through this program, we work with the women, rural women, especially the women farmers and the women pastoralists. So coming to this debate of climate finance as grassroots organization or women organization working on the ground, it is really a dilemma for us because it is difficult, and we've been advocating for that accessibility of climate finance, green fund. All this, it's very difficult for grassroots organization or women-led organizations. But more than that, we tried hard to get some funds because climate change is real in our communities, is affecting mainly the farmers in general, but we care about the small-scale farmers and especially the women farmers. So through our search for funding, we been able to attract funds from the African Development Bank for a program building resilience, climate resilience through women and youth. And this program mainly for women farmers, and this is really, it seems like a success story, because when the women farmers and small-scale farmers get buckets of inputs which help them to increase their production and productivity despite the climate change effect and in terms of droughts or flood. So we really feel that any discussion regarding climate finance should involve and should include women voice, women from the ground, women farmers, women-led organizations, and to be part of the designing of the policy of trust transitions, because this is really important for them, and they have the experience and they have the insight information that it can be important when it comes to the just transition, which is affecting their communities and their living. So this is, I really wanted to share this because we feel if there is accessibility and for women-led organization or grassroots organization, it is really paying back, and it's help in food security and for all living of those communities at the ground. Thank you so much, and I will, if there is any question, I will be an answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fatma, for sharing with us that particular experience from Sudan. And I think we can't overemphasize the point that you're making around the need to involve grassroots. And there's someone in the Q&A who has said that the requirements needed / bureaucracy to access climate finance makes it difficult for communities at the grassroots level to access this funding. If we really need to help communities, then we should ease the process to make to make them accessible to these funds. Yes, thank you so much. And I'll encourage people who are joining us online, if you have a question or a comment, you can just drop it in the Q&A section. I'll now open up to the audience. If there is anyone who would like to share their reflections, kindly take up the space. Anyone would like to ask a question or share a reflection, there's a mic behind you. So if you feel if you've been inspired, if you've been challenged, if you'd like to ask a question, there's a mic at the back. You can just get up and share or ask a question. So we'll give it a few minutes. If there is no one, then I'll just quickly go back to the panel.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Hi, good morning. My name is Mika Polanco. I work at USAID in the Office of Central America and Mexico. And thank you so much for these really interesting and important points. And sorry, I should mention that I'm the gender advisor, gender and gender-based violence advisor there. I hear from the World Bank, and I speak also, I come from the funder world as well, some very thoughtful, really elaborate, long list of things that the World Bank is doing to really lean in into gender, to understand the dynamic and complicated relationship between gender and climate, to undo some of the historical problematics. And it's wonderful. But I'm also hearing some really, really important and profound what's the word? Like insights on how those things are not working and what's being missed and how they're sort of, your talks weren't about the specific policies that Anne brought up, but you are seeing things that are very, very important and show that these policies, et cetera, are maybe not doing what they intend to do. And to me, it's always interesting to see how many people with good intentions end up doing, missing the point completely, not because there's like a bad side or like evil people in a closed room who are like trying to mess everything up, but people who with very good intentions, but somehow there's like a disconnect. I think, for each of you, for some of you, you talked about very, very nuanced, context-specific reasons that it's not working, and for others of you, you talked about broader structural reasons that these policies are not working. On both, sort of up and down that scale of like very contextual to very structural, there seems to be a miss, right? Kind of talking across or like it's not hitting the point. It's not doing what it intends to do. And so I was wondering, primarily from our civil society colleagues, if you could talk about where you see this conversation becoming more meaningful. And sorry, let me just say one other thing before I frame the question. For me at USAID, in my role, I always say, like, yes, we need to talk more to civil society organizations. Yes, we have to hear more. Civil society organizations should be should be guiding our work, or local NGOs, and everyone goes like, yes, 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 we agree. But then it doesn't quite happen. So I was curious from our civil society colleagues if you could talk more about what you think would work better, where you think there's really important processes, let's say, that could be transformed, or relationships that could be shifted, certainly power dynamics that need to be adjusted. I'd love to hear more from you on that. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that question.
Can I ask my question,
Please
or did you want to
ahead.
go to the panel
Yes.
first?
No, please go ahead. We'll go to the panel at once.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Justine Sylvester. I work at the Energy and Extractives Global Unit here at the World Bank. So my unit, we are the mining unit. We've had a bit of a transition ourselves in that we now focus more on critical minerals for the energy transition, and small-scale artisanal mining, and also a lot on the transition away from coal. So we're trying to operationalize a lot of this work for the energy transition now. I just wanted to draw attention to two initiatives that are underway that my unit is leading, and then I have a question for the panel. So the first one is, last year we published a paper actually called A Feminist Perspective on a Just Transition Away from Coal, where we've tried to identify some of the really gendered impacts of the energy transition, specifically on coal communities. As we know, this just transition term is very broad. There's not yet a single definition, but this paper is specific for coal, not for other sectors like transport or agriculture. So if you look that up, it may be interesting if you haven't seen it already. And the other initiative is this just transition taxonomy, which is under development, coming back to the first speaker about how do we channel climate finance. Well, this taxonomy is supposed to provide a bit of a classification system, again, specifically for the coal sector. And it's supposed to give lenders and also governments an idea of how their economic activities can support just transition efforts. It's spread across 3 pillars. There's a governance pillar, so that would attract public financing, hopefully.
Summarize?
Sorry?
Could you kindly summarize to...
Oh,
Could you kindly summarize to allow for other people to share?
So yes, those are the two initiatives that are underway, and the World Bank Treasury is leading the taxonomy work. So the question is actually very similar to what my USAID colleague just asked. We're really interested in how we can channel World Bank efforts into the communities that are most affected by the energy transition. And so I'd love to hear from the speakers how you think the World Bank and other donors can actually partner to get this impact more into these communities who are most affected. Thanks.
All right.
Hello. Shall we continue with questions, or do we have time?
I think just one more pass on yourself, if you could make it brief.
Okay. Hi, hello. My name is Gedre Yokubowskaita. I am a lecturer, senior lecturer at the University of Glasgow. I have a question for Anne. My question is about the removal of energy subsidies and how that interlinks with gender perspectives. So really, my question, and it's something that I've really been grappling with this week, there was this knowledge cafe recently about energizing Africa. And so there's this hype about this idea that, okay, we can energize Africa, as they called it, or, you know, increase energy access by at the same time removing energy subsidies and increasing private sector participation. My big worry here, and something we haven't mentioned today, is microfinance. So I worry that that will leave people basically responsible for paying for their energy access. And microfinance is very, very, very expensive, or tends to be very expensive, and has very big gender impact. So I really wanted to hear your point on how exactly will this work, because that's one thing I can't quite wrap my head around. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. So I will go back to the panel. I think we'll hear first from those in the room, and then we'll come back online.
I don't know if you can see, but there are actually 3 other people lined up to ask questions. And I don't know if we can capture anyone online.
Sorry about that. I didn't think that. Okay, sure. So if 1 minute each, because we are running out of time. Please take up the mic.
Oh, hi, my name is Emily Ghosh. I'm from the Stockholm Environment Institute. I have two questions. One about the gender area. I know you've been talking a lot about empowering women by entering the workforce, but has there been many efforts in looking into paying for unpaid labor? Women work for the most part, but it's unpaid, so I wonder to the extent to how much has been done there, as well as in terms of, there's a lot of cultural aspects to gender roles, and how much focus has been on building male allyship and that sort of thing. So I just wanted to hear on that perspective. And then on some of the more structural issues, we've been talking about the debt spiral. We've been talking about, how aid in other sessions, how aid is quite tied, and how higher income countries, people, these adaptation funds, loss and damage, now the loss and damage fund, adaptation fund has been largely unsuccessful so far because it hasn't been able to raise the money. And then, the systems that we have been using, getting people to work in the market, but then poor wages, like dealing with poverty on multiple levels. And so it seems quite hopeless, given all these different areas of failure, from our trade systems to debt to, market-based approaches. Where do you see hope? Is there anything that really stands out in terms of some of the systemic changes that we want? And it'd be great to hear where you think that would be.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes, thanks. And I am Athena, working with the World Council of Churches. And my question will be very short because it's very much related to the previous speaker. I just wanted to ask the panelists what their reflections are when it comes to the just transition and care economy nexus. What does a just transition mean for the care economy, which is where women predominate? And it's, as the previous speaker mentioned, this is largely unpaid work as well. So what does this also mean when it comes to financing the just transition?
Thank you so much.
I think I'm the final question, and I'll make it brief. I'm Ruta Eres, and I'm a senior advisor in economic growth and trade in the GenDev Hub at USAID. And I know this may not be a welcome question, but I've heard a lot of focus on the need for the public spending and the government's involvement, and a lot of questions and difficulties of working with the private sector. I've worked for the private sector, so I know it is difficult, but I just wanted to stress the fact that we shouldn't be, I don't think we should be very binary about, have that dualistic approach, because governments also change and shift, and we've seen that a lot in recent years. And so it's also not necessarily the most dependable partner for some of these initiatives. Private sector has a lot of issues as well, but I think we need to break that down into different private sectors. In all these communities, you have businesses, you have the private sector already there. So I'm just wondering, and maybe there isn't time, but to reflect on what are some of the successes that have been had, and not put all private sector in one group. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I would love to respond to it, but I will let my panel address it, since they are the ones who are leading us through this conversation today. So over to you, Jen, and then we'll have Mariana and Anne and come back online.
Okay, thank you so much, Faith, and thanks so much for the comments and ideas coming up. I'll just be brief, looking at the way forward, and maybe respond to some of the issues coming up. One, it's important to continue our demand that the developed countries pay. The loss and damage fund, we need the resources. It's our right to get it. Two, I think we need to change the narrative when it comes to climate financing. because the narrative is that the Global South has no money, no funds. So the funds have to come from the Global North, and it has to be innovative financing, private financing. We need to change that narrative. And Mariana talked about the outflow of resources. We need to look inwards in our countries to see how we can be able to generate our own resources. Because we are talking about sustainable, fair, just sustainable. When you look at all these finances, all the projects we have had, the project from Gertrude, 5 years, is that sustainable? It is not sustainable. So let us look inwards. In our countries, the resources are there. I will just give you an example of the critical minerals. Most of those critical minerals are in the Global South, and we are looking at how to beneficiate those minerals. And that's already money. But Mariana has talked about the outflow of resources. So sometimes we engage on, we run around climate financing, credit markets, and we forget to look at what's really important, looking at what we have internally and how we can be able to mobilize our own resources. Number 3, where, listening to Gertrude, I started wondering what should be the role of the bank. Because at the end of the day, I was thinking, are we talking about the World Bank, or are we talking about a microfinance institution somewhere? So we need to be clear what should be the role of the bank, with due respect. What should be our role when it comes to not just climate financing, but looking at the financing broadly? Because for me, my feeling is that the bank is going too low at the household, at the local level, lending to groups, even Gertrude's groups, lending to those groups. So we need to demarcate clearly what's the role of the World Bank, what's the role of the state, and what's the role of the private sector. The private sector, we are not putting it, my sister, in the same basket, but the private sector is about profit. And the challenge in Africa is that our governments, because of structural policies, structural issues, have lost the ability to regulate the private sector in public interest. So you find the private sector scavenging all over, looking for profits everywhere, even in public goods like health, water, education. So we need to put that right. Lastly, I think when we talk about climate financing, we should be looking at the structural transformation of our economies. And that's the only way we can talk about sustainable climate financing. When we have structurally transformed our economies, we are adding value, industrializing, creating decent jobs for our people. With due respect to World Bank, it will be difficult for World Bank to create decent jobs for our people when the entire economy, look at Uganda, we are commodity dependent, we export raw coffee. So in such circumstances, how do you create decent jobs for women? So we need to look at it broader as an entire economy, transforming structurally the entire economy. And lastly, we need to analyze, when we are talking about the transition, we need to look at contextually the nature of that transition, even the speed You know, somebody talked about the care economy. That's, unless you look at it contextually, that's when you will need to be able to know this is what we want. These are the gaps you want to address in the care economy. And that means that in that way, when we are specific, contextual, we won't leave anyone behind. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jen. Thank you very much, Jen. Quickly, you, Mariana, I see we have run out of time, but if you could just address a few issues.
Yeah, actually, Jane has covered some of the points I was going to make. I guess maybe one of the things we have to be really mindful in terms of what on this whole systemic change, in terms of what the right architecture should look like. It was I think it was a question from Say. There are alternatives out there. For example, we should really put people in communities in the driving seat. That means, for example, when you look at debt, how can you have like a UN debt workout mechanism? When I look about tax, we look at the formation of a UN tax convention coming into place. How can we reform trade agreements for that, for just transitioning developing countries? Should we look into intellectual property rights regimes to have like trip waivers? There's so many measures who are part of that vision of what the right type of reform should look like. I guess the main concern that we have going back is how the evolution roadmap, the playbook, heavily approach in terms of the leveraging private sector investments as it current stands can do more harm than good. So we saw that on the billions to trillions agenda, the cascade effect didn't really bring all the promised money. So more than ever, I think an external independent evaluation would be needed before this progress further. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mariana. I think the list can go on, because even when we think about the WTO development agenda and how it was thrown off the agenda, I think these are things that we need to bring back. Over to you, Colin.
Thank you, Faith. I hope I can be heard. Okay.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure I can be heard. I think most of the issues have been handled, and so I would stick to a few and also try to look at the question that we have online. How can the World Bank come in? I think strategically the bank needs to look at the issue of dealing with debt. That is one thing that we need to have a look at very critically. And I can't labor the point that have been mentioned before I came in. I'm not sure how to put it, but if a country is already dealing with debt, for instance, Kenya is dealing with debt, and constantly, in a way, the World Bank decides to de-risk the private sector, or lobby governments to de-risk the private sector to invest in climate action, for instance, in FLOCA, burdening the country with other loans. I don't think if that is quite effective of the bank to be able to look at that in that aspect. So it is one way for the bank to be able to come in and just paint the picture as is. It is not going to work for the bank probably to constantly advise a country like Kenya that you still have some debt ceiling that can be raised. It's impossible. If you look at Kenya's GDP debt ratio, if you look at the rest of Africa, it's going to the worst. So let's face it, and let's be honest in our conversations. The second thing, in terms of how the World Bank can come in, is leading the way in reforming the financial institution or the financial architecture has been mentioned, to be able to encompass the principles of equity, fairness, and justice. So that is something that we are looking at the World Bank as a guiding institutions to its subsidiaries to follow the principles of fairness. We are facing multiple crises, and it's written already in the concept note for this activity. So it's important and imperative that the bank leads the way in inculcating within itself and the rest of its subsidiaries the principles of fairness, equity, justice, so that while providing finance, and this is why we are very keen on financial flows through public means. I know there has been said that governments change, but I think I said earlier that lessons have proved us right, that to some extent, resources provided through public means do not impoverish communities. And this is where we want the bank to come in. I've been asked a question, stepping out of how the World Bank can come in. Yes, I've been asked a question on, can I give some insights on how climate finance can be provided in a balanced way from public and private sectors? We need to interrogate, and I know there is on the table a proposal from a Norwegian government for ODA to be constantly 0.7, and on to 0.7, every developed country adds 0.3 of climate finance, so that we broaden the investment space, so that new and additional becomes the 0. I think these are just proposals that we can be able to have a look at, but I would be proposing that one of the ways that we can be able to look at bringing in equal share or contribution to climate finance through public and private means, well, it's sort of broadening that aspect. It is very unfortunate that we are investing in public good, which is adaptation, through loans. That is one of my biggest problem with private sector investing in adaptation, and we have to get that right. The other thing that we can be able to have a look at is okay. Let me stop at that Faith.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Colin. I think I dropped out at some point. Sorry about that. I think as we close, I just wanted to invite Anne to make her final remarks, and then we will close the session.
Thanks very much, Faith, and to all colleagues here who have asked such thought-provoking questions. I'll try, there were quite a few of them, I'll try to kind of take them in turn. There was a question around the energy subsidy analysis and what did that look like? And so we've had numerous kind of evaluations that have looked at this and see that actually they are regressive in terms of households at higher income tiers are actually the ones that are gaining the benefit from the way these subsidies are being delivered, and they're not reaching the poorest. And so some of the reforms that have been suggested are around for those particularly marginalized groups. In some cases, it's kind of female-headed households, although even that category has to be looked at a little bit, because we've seen, again, from our poverty group that it's the dependency ratios in households, meaning children and elderly within households, that actually determines a lot of the poverty makeup of those households. And so even though we've been using the shorthand of female-headed households, for example, as a target group to try to push support to, and we roughly, that works. Even that, from the gender group side, we've been looking at more carefully with our poverty group to make sure that we have nuanced definitions of who needs support. But that targeting piece aside, the broad issue of how subsidies go out has shown that it's benefiting the kind of middle-income households more than the poorest. And that affects then what countries are able to do in terms of delivery of services overall, because they've got to be financing their the distribution of these. On the there was a broad question around what sorts of hope does one have in this context of working on gender equality and shifts to the goals we want to see in terms of transformative outcomes. And I'd say I'd really, come back. We were talking about participation earlier, but also women's leadership in this context, which is a big push on our gender strategy. And there, over time, we've seen in countries like Bangladesh, for example, that inclusion of women in disaster risk reduction and local level committees around planning ex ante for community response to in the context of extreme events has really reduced the gender gap in terms of mortality and morbidity. Something like ratio of 15 women to 1 man dying in an extreme event have gone down to kind of 4 to 1. So that's, there's still a gap, but it's a huge difference. And that's been over years where these have the processes as well as the hard infrastructure in terms of cyclone shelters and the socialization of use of those shelters, so that in conservative environments women feel socially sanctioned to be able to move to those shelters, has made a difference in terms of outcomes, even in cyclones of comparable size. And other countries are now learning from that, and including women in disaster risk mapping and thinking about what that looks like in the local context. On the just transition side, there's lots of ways to be thinking about, again, distributional outcomes in terms of what's happening in support to communities. And some of this is very socio-spatial, as I was talking about, where coal-dependent communities, in India, for example, are often in forested areas and scheduled tribe populations that are kind of socially excluded, and there aren't that many other, as we were talking about, alternative employment opportunities. And so, just as Jane was talking about the importance of thinking structurally, how are these subnational economies developing, and what sorts of support is there to offer kind of alternatives, we need to be thinking kind of holistically in terms of area investments as well as the support to individual workers and household members. The care economy came up as a question, and we've seen this most particularly in the context of climate and health, where women are still predominantly caregivers in terms of sick and elderly members, and with the increase in vector-borne disease in a lot of countries, a real disproportionate burden on them in that context. We are looking at support to also things like childcare and making those sorts of services kind of free up women's time in some context, as well as offering opportunities for early childhood development and pieces like this. But the care economy is something that we look at less from the side of kind of wages attached to that, but more from how it's enabling participation in the economy and society more broadly. And then this question of private sector, I'd probably just end on that, and again endorse the comments made by our colleague here from USAID and from Jane as well around, that there's really this panoply of actors, and fundamentally, World Bank is working on national economic development and then what that looks like across the country, spatially, sectorally, et cetera. And so for households and areas to really be less vulnerable, we do need that sorts of local investment, the domestic economic development that happens. When we look at agriculture, for example, it's that sort of value chain development that's locally based and adding value in the context of resources they've got. And in terms of climate finance on the energy side, for example, we saw from the climate investment funds that it's really sometimes those big infusions that it takes in investments like solar energy, for example. When it's now not an emergent technology, but when the climate investment fund started, 12 or 14 years back, the that was an emerging area, and you needed that sort of innovative, leading edge investment to prove that there was potential there. And similarly now with geothermal or some of these others. And then that does trickle down, because in the case of Kenya, you're able to go to that last mile. You have very good energy access in the country, but through those investments in generation, able to then cover the island communities or, you know, the absolute most remote areas that the majority of the rest of the grid hadn't yet covered. And that has a very, very real livelihoods impact and economic impact in terms of what you can then do with that power. And on the gender side, we make sure that there's also investments in complementary services, the business development services, and entrepreneurship, and all of those kinds of things that can help make women not just kind of consumers in these contexts, but producers in a real value addition sort of way. And it leads to empowerment, the women's voice then, and how they're kind of looked at in the community and at the household level in terms of exit options really does move, and that's the empowerment we're talking about. I think I've spoken a bit too much, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne, and thank you so much to our panel. Thank you so much to the participants that have managed to join us, particularly those that have joined where it's within a weird time zone. We do appreciate your presence. I just want to close us off. We at Akina Mama are just concluding a paper that we are calling Can Climate Finance Be Global South and Feminist Centered? 10 Principles to Consider. And some of these principles that we are highlighting are things to do with the need for us, for climate finance to be debt-free, to be long-term, to be gender-responsive, to be intersectional, to be anti-capitalist, to be decolonial, and the list goes on until number 10. And one of the other things that we say is that we need to adopt transformative solutions and transformative practices. And these are really practices that do not necessarily have to be new, since the majority of them are really rooted in local realities, in the respect of the environment, and work to ensure collective well-being. So these transformative solutions really just illustrate already existing initiatives and practices that inspire systemic change, that counterbalance prevailing unsustainable practices and provide inspiration for a transition towards social economic models that promote social justice and respect planetary boundaries. They put in mind gender, age, class, sex, ability, ethnic, indigenous dimensions, among others. And I think that these are some of the things that we need to continue reflecting on as we seek to influence the kind of climate finance architecture that we need, whether it's at global or regional or national and community level. Thank you so much for joining us, and we wish you a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.